think we're good.
All right. So I'm just going to
G'day, everyone. I'm really sorry for that couple of minutes wait. We're having a few technical difficulties, but welcome. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our new show for Australia Institute TV, Pole Position. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Canberra is Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present and to the traditional owners here. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Days and times for our webinars and TV shows do vary, so head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to check out all those events and to register for future ones. And just before we begin, if you're new to Zoom or new to webinars, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button where you can type in questions for our panel, and you should be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments as well. A reminder to please keep things civil in the chat or we'll have to boot you out. We don't do it often, but we will if we have to. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and will be posted up on our website and emailed to everyone who registered after the event. So this is Pole Position, the show formerly known as Political Geek Fest, and it's a new Australia Institute TV show to give you the inside story on what's going on in Canberra and what the public actually thinks, not what all the pollies tell us they think. So I want to welcome everyone who's joining us today from The Guardian and from Australia at Home, the former home of Political Geek Fest, and welcome regular viewers of Political Geek Fest. All of us political geeks here at the Australia Institute are absolutely delighted to be the new home for this show, where we're going to deep dive into all the latest political polling from the Guardian Essential Report fortnightly. And we're delighted to welcome back Katharine Murphy, political editor of Guardian Australia, and Pete Lewis, executive director at Essential Media. And Pete, I guess I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ebony, and hi, everyone. That's the most professional intro we've ever had to one of our polling discussions, and it's great to be part of the Australia Institute family. For those who haven't been with us before, during the lockdown, we just started having a weekly chat about politics as part of the Australia at Home project, which was to provide a bit of an anchor for people during lockdown. And we kind of enjoyed it, didn't we, Katharine? And I think bouncing a pollster and a pundit and almost working our theories out as we look at the graphs, it obviously was a great experience for me, and hopefully sort of helped inform some of the great work you did last year. The way we normally run these is we put out our essential report, Guardian Essential Report, every fortnight, and we just really go through the slides and bounce off and see what comes. Our head geek, John Remington, is in the room as well. Hey, John. And if we don't understand a cross tab, we throw to him and he can sort of give us a few insights as well. But normally, Katharine, hello, we start with a bit of the vibe, and today's like the Canberra equivalent of HSC, isn't it? It's the big exam where you all go into lockup and have to read heaps of stuff and make sense out of it. So what is the vibe this budget, and how different is it from last year's?
On Canberra's Night of Nights, first of all, apologise to everybody for crashing in. I did have a few technical difficulties at the start, and we'll keep praying to the tech gods that I don't suddenly disappear. But anyway, let's be positive. As Pete says, yes, we did do these sessions through last year as I think sort of sanity savers for both of us, and the audience seemed to enjoy them as well. So and we're delighted to be in our new home. In terms of the question, Canberra's Night of Nights, the budget, drum roll please. It's sort of strange really, because budgets in Canberra used to be really massive focal points of any political year. In the olden times, or not even really in the olden times, as recently as only a couple of years ago. But because of COVID, the pandemic, we've sort of basically been in a rolling budget for the last 18 months, which sort of tends to strangely sort of suck attention away from budget day. It was a bit the same last October, and it sort of feels a bit the same today as well. Look, there's been a lot of pre-announcements, as is always the case ahead of the budget. I think there's a couple of surprises expected this evening, a couple of measures that haven't yet seen the light of day in terms of the pre-announcements. I don't know, it's hard to put my finger on it exactly, but it's just it's a very important budget, this, in the sense of we're going to see some funding of social services that will be very welcome, but obviously we need to look very closely at the quality of the spend as well as the quantum of it. So we'll have more to say about that once we actually see it. And it's pretty obvious that the government is setting this up as a potential election budget, it's a very voter-friendly budget. I would describe it that way, certainly at least on the advance publicity. So long-winded response that says yes, it's a big day, but somehow a little bit less big than some other days because we have been in this rolling process, but important because we got some big social announcements at the centre of the budget, which is a sort of big change in priority and identity for the government. And also it's very much a keep your options open budget, I reckon, in terms of election timing.
So we've got some polling on where the two leaders sit at the moment, some expectations of budget, and then a couple of international issues that we'll run through. I guess before we get there, though, just a general observation, the budget seems to be being framed around what it's not, which is not an austerity budget. How important do you think that messaging has been for the way people are approaching the budget today?
Yeah, well, I think if we sort of think about it in terms of the government's identity, this government started with a bang in its first budget in 2014, which was very much an austerity budget. And basically a lot of the measures that were imposed in that budget in order to deal with what the coalition was styling at that time as a debt and deficit emergency were conceived in very unfair ways. Basically, the less you earned, the more you paid. And that was quite catastrophic for the government politically, that first budget. And it was the beginning of the end of Tony Abbott, that first budget. So the government has tracked a long way since 2014. And in fact, if we sort of look at every budget since 2014, what we can see is that slowly, budget by budget, the government has been shedding elements of that sensibility and that sort of ideological framing that it started with. This is not obviously the only expansionary budget that this government's delivered. So anyway, we're sort of on a long walk. We're on a long march away from 2014, which I think still lives large in the consciousness of this government, given that it's the same government that was around in 2014. It feels like it's had, a sort of few refreshes since then, but it is in fact the same government. And in terms of the framing, yes, it's, I think the other thing that's shifted really in the last 18 months, which has sort of given a foundation for whatever we see tonight in terms of social spending, is the pandemic has really, refreshed the idea of government in the minds of people and what governments can or should do, how active governments should be in people's lives, how active governments should be in terms of protecting people's safety and creating decency, dignity and opportunity for people. So in a way, it's sort of like the government's leaning into the zeitgeist, I think, of the pandemic. But the problem with a conversation like this is, though, we're still pre-budget and we can't really make firm or informed decisions in advance of the facts, which is why I said a moment ago, look, all the pre-announcements suggest that this will be a big spending budget and spending on services that are important to Australia, as the poll certainly shows this week. But we can't, I'm reserving judgment like everybody as to the quality of the spend and whether it sort of does the heavy lifting required in order to treat two big serious problems in Australia, one aged care and the other the mental, a literal epidemic of mental ill health among Australians, young people, Australians really across the spectrum, but particularly young people.
Well, let's dive into the numbers and do what I guess we can do, which is give people a bit of a situation analysis of where the budget is landing now. And interesting figures this week, if you look at and obviously John puts these questions in the field, monthly approval of our leaders. Do you approve or disapprove of the job Scott Morrison is doing as Prime Minister? Now, he's been coming off a torrid couple of months, right through, lockdown, and people can see it on this slide, the 60 plus approval, which you and I interpreted really as an approval of the role he did. The question is personal, but it was also an endorsement of government in general and the role government played last year. It dropped off significantly through the troubles of the first quarter of this year. It feels like the heat's gone out of that a little bit. And is that just a case of time healing all, or is something else been going on down there, do you think, to stabilise for him?
Well, I think some of the issue we're referring to there in terms of the troubles is obviously Parliament's Me Too movement, which was triggered by an allegation of rape levelled by the former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins. There was also an allegation of rape levelled against the Attorney General, which he obviously comprehensively denies, and he's now involved in a defamation case against the ABC. But as Pete says, yes, that's the source of the troubles. That's why the Prime Minister really racked up some of the worst performances of his prime ministership over the first quarter of this year. The other moving part has been the delays in the vaccination program, and our previous polling data indicates that Australian voters are have a very clear sense of who is responsible for that the Commonwealth, the vaccination rollouters, if that's even a word. So if things go wrong in that program, they will know who to blame. So obviously, torrid first quarter of the year. I think in terms of framing up what the rest of the year looks like, the government has certainly used this pre-budget period to tip out a lot of pre-announcements and
particularly on some women's issues too, right?
Yeah.
So early learning, childcare. I think they put. So
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a call in response to this recovery of numbers or just the passage of time from that intense period. The gender numbers are also quite interesting. A sharp uptick. John, I might just bring John in here. Do you read that as just a bit of bounciness in the figures last time or something else? So the approval of women had dropped well below 50% and it's back into positive plus 50% territory now.
Yeah, as you and Katharine said there, I think there was a reaction to what has been in the media and the news, and whether or not this is a bounce or a turning of the tide in terms of that cycle and where people are thinking, we'll have to do a few more periods to see. We don't usually want to identify trends until we've got at least 3 data points from a very statistical point of view. So at the minute, this is more of a early notice, a speculative result rather than anything more definitive.
What do you reckon, Katharine?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's interesting, and it's sort of consistent with the Me Too issues going slightly off the boil and the government's sort of efforts to occupy the space pre-budget. And again, if we sort of pull out of the measures, Pete, because you referenced, a number of the sort of pre-announcements were focused on women, but it's sort of like the general tenor that the government is trying to present through this budget is that it is in fact empathetic, that it maintains a connection with the concerns of ordinary Australians, and that's it's not only the women's issues that we'll see tonight, it's also mental health and aged care, which are huge issues for voters. So if you sort of characterise the first 3 months of the year as Scott Morrison not listening and looking sort of like he had no idea what people, how he had no idea. He presented as a person who had no idea about the emotional hinterland of Australian women really for the first 3 months of this year, which was quite a thing really to witness. The government's kind of framing the budget as a much more empathetic statement of connection with voters. Look, we get it. We understand these social services are really important to you. That's why we're looking at funding them forget the fact that in 2014 we were the austerity merchants. We're not that anymore. And the pandemic has sort of validated this broader role for government. So
yeah,
that's...
Katharine, I was going to ask, because last year's budget was more or less billed as the blokes budget, and it targeted a lot of spending at really male-dominated industries for public spending and investment. So we've seen stuff on childcare. You've mentioned aged care. Are you expecting have there been any leaks about, what more we're expecting him to do to fix that women's problem, so to speak?
Yes, it's a good question, Eb, and you're right to remind people that certainly in the last budget, it was roundly criticised for being too blokey, sort of a very, very, very narrow cast in its focus. I think we'll see. Obviously, the aged care package is going to be large. The pre-billing is 18 billion over the forward estimates, which is obviously a lot of money. But there's a whole lot of detail in there we need to come to terms with. They've pre-announced childcare, but I think there will be another measure related to that that will be confirmed tonight. That's speculative at this stage, but I'd be looking at that as a marker for what might emerge tonight. So I think there's sort of been, between the combination of the last budget being castigated as all about blokes, the horror show the first 3 months of the year has kind of taught them, to sort of frame their communications differently. But again, it's until we see the substance of it, we'll reserve judgment about the quality until we see the substance of it.
Meanwhile, we've got Labor, who I think are in quite a difficult position this budget. I feel a little bit they're snookered, particularly around the top line figures and the fact the government's going to run a deficit. If Labor feels to me, if Labor says the budget is their government's not spending enough, that just shows you can't trust Labor with money. And if they say that they should be bringing the deficit in, they will go to, well, everyone knows that Liberal governments always have lower deficits. They're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. Albo's kind of been in kind of solid state for a while, although I do note that this is the first time approvals dip below 40%, Katharine. But it is a difficult position, because while budget is the big day for the government, budget reply has traditionally been this defining moment for the opposition as well. And it feels to me all they can really do is move through it and not spend too long talking about a Liberal government delivering a Labor budget.
Well, it's sort of I agree in the broad. It is we're sort of back into a crowding out problem, just because the weight of incumbency in budget week and the nature of the measures and the fact that they're sort of moving into Labor light territory does increase the degree of difficulty for Labor in terms of framing a response. And I understand the traps and the pitfalls that you've identified there, right? But it also, just on the economic management point, it's sort of that it narrows the discussion, though, too, between the major parties at the next election about budget management, about the role of government. It's sort of like those differences are now not as stark as they might have been even a few years ago. Now, what that does to the election conversation, I'm not really sure about yet. I did a podcast with Simon Birmingham for last weekend, in which we traversed that territory a little bit. And Birmingham was the view that there would still be a sharp contest and it would be about the quality of the spending. But I'm not sure myself how that washes through the system.
I've got a pretty clumsy analogy that I've got in a column that should be up in The Guardian soon about glass half empty, glass half full, but concluding that maybe what Labor needs to do is take its lead from Tony Abbott in opposition with the GFC spending and focus on water quality rather than the amount in the water. So we'll remember that when Labor put a lot of money to stabilise the economy, the Liberals just honed down on overpriced school canteens and pink bats. And I think their Labor does have a bit of fertile ground. So there's the quantum of the spending and the quality of the spending. And, you're talking about a government that's already got form on sports rorts and regional development plans, and now also a bit of a penchant to spend a lot of money on highly paid consultants as well. So maybe they, rather than going big, the strategy will be to go small.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like just very quickly before we move on, I think Anthony Albanese's sort of overriding concern through the difficulties of being an opposition in pandemic times has been to make sure that he doesn't increase his own negatives. If we sort of think back to Bill Shorten as opposition leader, he was probably better known than Albanese in the public, but also people had very strong views about him.
So he's still at 35. That's not nothing, but it's not majority. I think Bill was up in the 40s for some of these.
That's right. So I think that's part of the strategy, but and I get that, because keeping your negatives low is better than having your negatives high, but you've also got to be visible, and you've also got to be presenting an alternative that cuts through and connects with voters.
Yeah, indeed. Quick thing there on the gender difference as well between women and men with preferred prime minister, but as you'll see, amongst women, the don't knows are significantly higher than the men. And so that's the real opportunity, I guess, for Albo there, Katharine. And so why don't we, because a lot of these folk aren't used to just staring at slides for a whole hour, we'll come up for air. Ebony reckons the Australian Institute people like to see people's faces. We'll see.
Not necessarily mine today, but thank you for that.
And never mind in my roof. We should probably just quickly tell people how we put this together, John, and then maybe also talk about why we don't do weekly horse race two-party preferred. But do you want to just give people a really short summary of our methodology and how we pull these polls together? And then maybe Katharine and I can talk about our hatred of the top line figure.
Yeah, there's been a couple of good questions coming through from Kevin on this in the questions, so it'll give me an opportunity to answer that as well. As I've said in the questions, if anyone hasn't seen on there yet, we speak to around 1,000 people every fortnight, and that's on a range of, as you've seen today, political, topical, and social issues. The questions that we have are publicised, but we also run some questions which we don't publicise for clients who then pay for them for their internal purposes. To make sure it's representative, we make sure that we speak to a range of ages, genders, locations, both in state and in cities and the countryside, and then we also apply a weighting process just to fine tune that to get it as close to the demographics of the country as possible. The intention for that to be that if we know that we're speaking to a representative number of genders, ages, locations, that should be representative of how people feel in the country as a whole.
And when you say you speak, you're not going out and knocking door to door anymore. That's how they used to do it in the old days.
That is.
So how do we do it these days?
We use exclusively online. There are still some telephone polling out there, and the most dreaded of all of the polling or research methodologies is the robopolls, which we
regard as political crack and we don't go near. But our panel is people registered to be on these market research panels. We buy a sample from a bunch of different panels to meet our ABS weighting. But the other critical thing that we stopped doing after the last election, after Katharine and I tried to work out what the hell had happened, and the whole team, was that we now put out our two-party preferred only every 3 months. So we're trying to move away from that idea that there's some mythical race and people are in front. And we also have started including the don't knows in that analysis anyway, which means that you end up with, and we'll go through it over one of these when at the appropriate time, but you'll find maybe a rating of 43, 45 with 7% undecided, which actually I think gives a clearer view of where the electorate is. And I think at the moment, I don't know if you've got at your fingertips or take on notice, John, what the undecideds were this week that we would take out of the sample, but it's a significant portion and it does change elections. But Katharine, I was going
to say, as Ben Oquist, our executive director, is fond of saying when it comes to political polls, and I think you mentioned before, never believe one, but believe 3 polls in a row if they're telling you something. It's really looking at that trend long term.
In a way, I think, Katharine, not looking at the voting intention has liberated us to dig a little bit deeper and try to make get a sense of what makes people tick.
Yeah, well, it's been really important for me as a reporter over the last 12 months to have a regular poll, a regular sort of access to voter sentiment about all kinds of stuff during the pandemic. It's been enormously helpful to just have that snapshot and see where people are kind of broadly lining up. In terms of the horse race, yeah, well, it's the horse race hasn't really served the public very well over the last several election cycles. And the sort of my short bit on the 2PP is that now the 2PP plus injects the level of uncertainty in that figure every time we report it. And the backward-looking approach sort of allows us to go and retrofit what may or may not have been going on in those periods. I don't know, though. I mean, it's a whole other discussion for people with much more technical expertise about polling than me. But obviously, there is a bit of a thing in Australia where all of the polls have overestimated progressive vote, the progressive vote over the, most particularly in the last election cycle. But I do think that is a phenomenon that the polling world sort of has been grappling with, not only here but internationally. And I don't quite know why the polls sort of slightly overrepresent the progressive vote. People, again, with more expertise than me would have, that'd be a whole conversation in and of itself, which we obviously won't bog you down with. But I guess from my reporting practice, look, that data set over the life of the pandemic is enormously helpful. And it just helps me frame, the likelihood of various probabilities. And I've done more. I mean, I think I've always reported polls carefully in the past, but I am certainly taking greater pains to inject a level of uncertainty into the reporting, which I think just is important and treats readers like they're intelligent people.
Thanks, Katharine. Let's jump into a few more of the insights from this week. I'll just do my quick remount into the slides. Budget priorities. If you give people the binary choice, as we have, it's overwhelmingly that people want the government to continue to be supporting rather than bringing things back into budget bottom line. I think really the budget is delivering on that, if nothing else, from what we can see. I guess the one caveat on the whole austerity narrative that my friends in the disability sector will point out is that there is a real austerity push moving into the NDIS. I know Katharine spoke to the new minister last week, and while it might be said that the numbers seem to line up pretty much with what the Productivity Commission projected from the beginning, she is seeing the sky beginning to fall there.
Yeah, that's a very much watch this space area, I think, in Australia over the next six to 12 months. Linda Reynolds is signalling that she needs another conversation with the states about the sustainability of the funding model for the NDIS. And there's a whole other set of propositions around independent assessments as well. It's a very important story, which we'll be keeping a close eye on.
Expectations of today's budget. I find this fascinating, the level of disengagement. The standout winner on most of these categories is don't know neutral. People expect the well-off and big business to do well because they always do, but also that sense you personally, and I feel there's a disconnect here between the messages the government's been putting out and the way it's currently being received, or at least perceived. Only 23% believe it, and maybe that's a response to no tax splash, tax cuts. Maybe that's a proxy, you personally, for tax cuts, I'm not sure, but it does seem to me that the government is shouting into a bit of a void.
Well, it just might be that sort of not sure element. It could be, as you say, but I think there's probably that assumes a level of engagement that most people probably don't really have. I think it's more there is this, it sort of goes back to where I started, I reckon, in the beginning of the conversation. There is this sort of slight diminution around the budget process this year. that it just doesn't quite have the stickability and the focal point of previous budgets. And the only theory I can come up with is because, you know, we've been shoveling money out the door for 18 months. So
the stimulus will not be interrupted. It will just continue.
We'll just continue. It's sort of like it's kind of picked us all up and put us down in a different place. Now, whether it's a durably different place, I don't know. We just have to wait and see. But I think that's part of it. It's just sort of like, you know, there's a lot of fog out there, and trying to sort of see through to very fine-grained detail, I think, sort of difficult. And yeah, that it just doesn't have the focal point it's had in previous years.
I reckon it's also, though, that the budget is seen as only part of the picture of governing more than before. You know, the public health response was front and centre last year, and the budget measures came in as almost the safety net under it. So you're kind of not leading with the budget supports the broader policy. And if we move to the next slide, just where people want to spend, you know, short thing everywhere. But you can see priorities, and obviously this was a closed list that we put on, but you can see, you know, those gender things, to Ebony's point, is very much there. But even if you go through all these issues, the pandemic challenge transcends that. So it feels to me the budget is this kind of broader safety net underneath it. We might just go through what stands out here to you. The fact that reducing the national deficit is bottom of the pops, probably more than anything. But
the sort of focus on the social spending and the lack of concern in the community about you know, debt and deficit, which and that's sort of like, that's actually really interesting. If you think about most of the budget conversation really over the last 20 years has been focused on budget repair rather than on structural spending and the case for it. It's quite a big turnaround in the psychology of the country, I think, and also anyway, I don't know where it leads us, but it's pretty pronounced in this budget.
Yeah, I think that perhaps also reflects just the dramatic shift from the coalition government, which, as you said, Katharine, you know, for decades has been pursuing nothing but budget surpluses and reducing the deficit as kind of the holy grail, when it's really just a tool in any kind of economic cycle. And that shift in rhetoric, I think, probably actually closer matches where the public is on this, but I think it will have shifted some of how the public views debt and deficit. It's certainly not the high priority that it used to be, you know, reinforced by what the political rhetoric was. And a lot of our own polling at the Australian Institute shows that same thing. You know, if you give people the choice between investing in services and, you know, now we've got the pandemic on top of all of that, you know, the debt and deficit just comes way down that list of priorities now. And people have direct experience now from a year of big government spending, big interventions, big announcements like free childcare, even if it was temporary. You know, it's direct lived experience of what extra investment in those services can provide for the whole community.
Yeah, exactly.
Also the sense of what government can do. So there's been this whole thing that government can't do that because the deficit, and the pandemic's kind of broken that, hasn't it? And I'm not saying we're in a world of modern monetary theory or anything, but we are in a world where there is a sense that government needs to do whatever it takes to look after its citizens. So I don't know if that you can pivot back to, well, we can't look after our citizens because deficit down the track. I don't know if that whole model's been broken, Katharine.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean about how the conversation shakes out, I guess, in terms of the major party conversation about economic management and debt and deficit. That's why I'm sort of putting a question mark over that. I just don't know how that shakes out, really, and what the implications of that are over the next, 12 months, over the next election cycle, over the next 3 years. The other moving part that we should mention just quickly, obviously, that's the moving part about that shifted this whole conversation, as well as the pandemic, as well as people rediscovering that governments can and should do things. We're in an environment of zero interest rates, effectively, and we've sort of reached the end of the efficacy of some of the economic tools that have governed this whole conversation for probably 30 years, really. So that an environment of zero interest rates also takes the sting out of borrowing, because if you can get to a sweet spot where obviously if the budget runs so hot that economic growth really picks up significantly, well growth kind of erodes the top line of the debt. So that's another factor.
Yeah, John, what's the voter breakdown on that national debt one? Is there any partisan split there?
Yes, as you might expect, there is some political lines running down there. So the reducing the national deficit, percentage of people who say it's very important or important, that's how those two red bars in there, that's 58% for coalition voters, or people who indicate they would vote for the coalition at the next federal election. A lot higher than Labour, which is at 43, Greens at 35, and then we often use an other, which are independents and minor parties, and they're at 48%. So
yeah, we normally think of the other as the yin to the Greens yang. So you've got the two major parties, Labor and Liberal, and then Greens and other, although it does sort of capture Centre Alliance and things. I'm not sure if they'd see themselves as yin to Greens yang, but who knows?
The majority of the other group are people who indicate they will vote for One Nation, and in the past, United Australia Party, although that's a lot smaller now.
Indeed. I just maybe have a look at a couple more slides. This surprised me, Katharine, after, not because it's contested, but just because it's not as strongly endorsed as maybe some of us thought. The support for the government of banning the Australian citizens, and also the fines. So while there was, I don't know the right term, there's majority support, but it's not over 50%. So I don't know if I'm using my right terms. But for both those statements, there is agreement, but not overwhelming agreement. And the one that has overwhelming agreement is actually we need to find a way to get
them back.
Yes. So it was a very strange little sort of three dance really from the Prime Minister, whereas they did the drop that we're going to get tough, they did the media release, and then it was just the media reporting it. We didn't mean to be penalising people after all. But it does speak to a bigger challenge, which I think which goes back to this idea that the budget is just a punctuation mark, which is how do you deal with a world that's still gripped by a crisis? Do you keep Australia as a lockdown country? Are you going to be starting to find avenues, not just for Australian citizens, but for critical industries back in or not? And where do you think the government's landing on that?
Yeah, well, it's sort of this goes back to the vaccination program. Look, it's starting to pick up now, it's starting to recover now, but the fact of the matter is the government really did botch that, and we are running behind other comparable countries. It is improving now, and not all of it wasn't all mismanagement on the part of the government. There was also bad luck, but that constrains Australia's options. In terms of reopening to the rest of the world. It is a fact that countries that have rolled out vaccination programs faster than us are moving more assertively into a conversation about reopening and how that happens. In Australia, we are constrained because we don't have a lot of herd immunity in the population because we haven't had all that many infections, and we're not sufficiently vaccinated to be having.
And the numbers, I know you were away a fortnight ago, but we had these numbers on vaccine hesitancy, which were mind-blowing. Over 50% of over 50s say they won't take AstraZeneca. Like, there is a serious structural thing going on in terms of how those vaccines, not just the supply, but then the agreement of citizens to go down.
Well, this is part of, and again, it's sort of not really the government's fault that problems sort of surfaced in the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's sort of, it remains just a miracle that it's worth just dwelling on for 5 whole seconds, that these vaccinations for COVID have been produced as quickly as they have been. It is a miracle. This has never happened this quickly before. And it is, and it's very, obviously it's bad luck. that there's some clotting implications for a small group of people associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. But I don't think the government handled the messaging around that very well at all. And now it has a significant hesitancy problem for obvious reasons. So in terms of like getting back to your crux point, which is when do we reopen? When does that happen? Well, it's in part a function of when the vaccination program happens. And the government says we get more Pfizer in the last quarter of the year. I hope that happens. And hopefully by next year, which will be the budget assumption, I gather, the budget will assume that the border reopens at some point next year. Hopefully then we're in a conversation about that, the how, when, why of all of that, because it's sort of a funny thing in terms of the economic picture, and it seems appropriate just to touch on this briefly given it's budget night. The government has sort of created all this artificial demand in the economy in a way by shutting the border so people can't leave. They can't spend money on overseas holidays or other things that they might have done. So they're buying cars and they're buying household goods. And so we've sort of got this recovery in consumption, which is actually quite important. But there's also capacity constraints on the economy because of a closed border. We've got no or not enough international students. The tourism sector is still in dire straits. I know one of my best mates has a small business and can't get employees for the particular small business that she runs, and she's used to people being able to bring in foreign workers, and businesses starting to slowly and quietly tear their hair out over that. Like, when can we actually get some people in the country? So it's actually a really interesting story how we wind out of all of this. And also the interesting bit of the story too is the expectations of people as we wind out of this, because we still don't know lots about COVID. There's all kinds of stuff we don't know. And at some point we're going to have to move from containing the virus to living with it. And that's a whole other lot of political calculations that the government's not even close to making, because the population's not vaccinated yet.
Yeah, and I think also that other countries are coming to that we need to live with it much faster than Australia, because they've already been living with it. Australia, I think part of this vaccination issue is also that because people aren't getting sick, there isn't the imperative to take the vaccine. And so the question why you're taking the vaccine needs to change, because if the answer to that is so we can re-engage with the world, it's a different decision matrix and a different way of explaining to people why they should jab some, vaccine into their arm. Last one, and I guess the elephant in the room for this budget is the Chinese. I don't want to use the term troubles again, but the standoffs that are affecting a whole range of industries, and there has been a bit of drum beating. And people are starting, or a significant number of people are now starting to feel concerned that we are heading down that slippery slope to some form of conflict. What have you been making of all that, and how does that feed into the budget, Katharine?
Well, obviously, the China's place in the world is a serious issue, and China, an authoritarian nation, has become more assertive, obviously, in announcing its presence to the world in all kinds of ways. So it's a real thing. I wouldn't for 1 minute minimise the strategic complexities of China's rise and the implications of it, and the rebalancing of power in the world between America and China. It's a big deal. It's a real thing. It's not a confected thing. However, what we have seen really in the government's rhetoric, and this gives you tracks us back to a budget that is about setting up options. I think Peter Dutton has obviously come to the defence portfolio. Dutton's a sharper political operative than you would normally see in the defence portfolio. Normally there's a sort of tamping down of the rhetoric, but Peter Dutton's a rev it up kind of guy, and we've seen a bit of revving up happening in terms of the rhetoric. Now, the funny thing is, I don't think Australia's policy about China, if viewed through that military prism, would be any different from Defence Minister Peter Dutton or Defence Minister Linda Reynolds. I don't think there's been any substantive change at all. But in terms of the rhetoric, raising the level of the risk, I suppose, reminds voters that the world's a dangerous place. We are the more trusted political party on issues of security and national security. Therefore, you might need us, guys, because things might go to poop in the world, is really the backdrop to some of the political rhetoric that we're seeing emerging at the margins in Canberra. And that's a sort of separate thing, although related to it, to a serious, substantive conversation that a whole lot of really smart people are having about the implications of China's rise, whether or not China's ambitions expand by economic means or expand by military means. So we sort of see these sort of the intersection of a kind of seminar that Australia and the world's having about China with some political imperatives that the government's starting to warm up, I think, through that prism of give yourself options, just in the event that we're off to the polls later this year.
Mm. Ebony, you've been looking at the chat and the Q&As coming through. We're very all disciplined dealing with that, so I'm happy to give you the floor to throw some things at Katharine particularly. And as people are here for the first time, it's just great fun to download your brain every now and then, Katharine. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that I'm sure you're not even sure it's all percolating away as you're giving that real-time feedback loop.
So yeah, there's a couple of questions kind of related. A lot of them relate to the budget and things we don't necessarily know, but I think we can still have a red hot go. So Kevin Hayes has asked a question here about the government being very focused on mining and physical infrastructure and the gas-fired recovery. And his question is around what we're expecting around human capital infrastructure, TAFE and labour force issues and that kind of thing. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
No, I can have a swing at that. And again, sorry to labour the point about not getting the analysis in front of the facts. It's only just because there is a whole lot of styling that happens pre-budget. That
I just ask a question: do you get drops from the Morrison government, or do they all go to the Australian?
No, we do, but we enter this field a bit judiciously because it's a bit of a trap, really, because you can sort of end up framing a document that turns out to be very different in the substance. So we do look, I mean, obviously I'm not on the high level information exchange, but look, we certainly do, but we do, anyway, that'd be a whole other conversation about the sort of the methodologies we apply to what we report and what we don't. Anyway, in terms of the skills question and the workforce question, look, I think we will see a bit in the budget. I don't know so much on the skills side, but certainly I think one of the bigger components of the aged care package will be sort of the workforce preparedness, as it were, like caring workforce initiatives. I think we'll see a fair bit of that tonight. And that's a really big thing that I hope they actually do well, because that's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people, and also it's a workforce that we desperately need given the ageing population. So anyway, we're sort of primed to expect a bit on the care workforce. As for skills, probably a bit, but I'm not entirely certain what we'll see.
Yeah. The next question is from Ivan Quayle. He mentioned that February in 2020 was a low point of approval after the bushfires, and asks, how do we get back to climate change action and put that back on the agenda?
Oh,
look, that's dear to your heart, Katharine.
Well, look, every waking day, my friends, climate change is put on the agenda by this little black duck. So I guess we just, how do we get it back on the agenda? Well, we just got to chip away at it. I think the difficulties, and I think I've might have expressed this on a webinar with you guys previously, Eb. I think it is a bit more difficult in a pandemic environment, in an environment of economic uncertainty, to get climate change sort of out of say number 3 spot on what is of concern to voters. But I think there are a lot of voters who are increasingly predominantly motivated by this issue, and I don't think that sort of level of community concern will go away anytime soon. The thing is just, and that you can see that because the government is trying to sort of look and sound a bit better on this stuff. The gas-fired recovery, it's talking about, but not really funding massively if we look at the dollars. And Morrison is also still engaged in this, this dialogue he has with himself about whether or not he can move to a commitment on net zero emissions by 2050, because he's under a lot of pressure by the Americans. We saw that.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much of the pressure is going to be external, internationally, compared to maybe domestic pressures?
Well, I think it's both, love. I think certainly we've got international pressure. We've seen that already from the Americans. Very, very blunt diplomacy from the Americans, by the American standards, just basically calling out the Australian government and saying, look, what you're doing isn't enough. That's quite a big thing for the Americans to do. And they did it certainly during the cycle of the Biden summit. There'll be a bunch of pressure from Britain and others ahead of the G7 in June for Australia to be on a more serious pathway to emissions reductions. And then we've got a COP at the end of the year, which is the UN-led climate change discussions. That's in November in Glasgow. The difficulty the government's going to have is that while Morrison's limbering up to do something on the net zero commitment by 2050, all the discussion, all the action sort of around the Biden summit, G7 and Glasgow will be the 2030 targets. And again, we're not really certain whether the government will lift any level of ambition there. But anyway, look, the answer to the question is I haven't forgotten about it. I still write about it most days. I keep pushing. That's all we can do.
Yeah.
Can I just say, we will throw a bunch of climate questions in for the next fortnight so we can go into this deeper. My suspicion is the issue is off the boil at the moment. There's been some comments in the chat about the sort of, when you've got a hot summer and you've got bushfires and things, it's in people's minds, and a wetter summer takes it off. I also think that it's not an area that Labor is consciously engaging in to the extent that it did in the previous political cycle. And John, I think we're seeing a bit of a drop on the urgency of those initiatives that used to be much higher up the top of the pops. But let's frame a few questions and do a few benchmarks that we've done previously and see where that lands in a fortnight's time.
We've probably only got time for one more question, and a couple of people have asked about the university sector, basically. One kind of asking around, is there too much reliance from universities on overseas students, but also it was kind of a sector that the government seemed to just abandon. And are we expecting anything in the budget to address that?
I think sadly, highly unlikely. Maybe some stuff at the margins, but I wouldn't expect a big sort of rescue package for universities tonight, sadly. This is one area that is sort of inexplicably bad about the government's response during the pandemic. I rate the government's economic response. I think everything on the health side has been has been a disaster, either minor or major. But I'm just talking about the Commonwealth level now. I think their economic response is, is quite good, not perfect, but quite good. But one of the real standout problems with it has been that the university sector has basically been left high and dry. And this is amazing, given that, the university sector in Australia is one of our biggest export earners. It's just extraordinary. And I still don't really have a clear sense of why that's happened. Anyway, no, look, I don't think masses for unis tonight. I hope I'm wrong, but that'd be my tip at this point.
Anything else to comment on, Pete, there with where kind of education comes in terms of polling and how much people care about it?
Look, one general observation is tertiary educated voters see the world very differently. They see the world through symbols and a different narrative, whereas, and they're not the majority of the population. I think we often fall into the trap of thinking that everyone sees the world the way we do, and part of the trick of politics and understanding how people tick is to get out of your own world and get into the world of people that have a different life experience. So often that's degraded as retail politics, but actually understanding where the different parts of Australia sit, where they see the world, what's important to them is actually both my job and also Katharine's job, and actually also the job of Scott Morrison and Albo. So we're all trying to work this out all the time. So I know I didn't answer the question about universities, but I do think that Australia is more than just the people sitting in this webinar, sadly.
Well, we might have to wrap it up there. So I want to thank you very much, Katharine Murphy, Pete Lewis, and John Remington for joining us today. I want to thank the 350 or so people who've joined us for this, our very first new venture for pole position. Thanks for all your great questions. As usual, we can't get to all of them, but we do appreciate it. And I just want to remind people we've got a couple of really great webinars coming up. So on Thursday at 5 p.m, we'll be talking to the United Nations high-level climate champion, Nigel Topping, and someone from Telstra to talk about accelerating Australia's race to zero ahead of getting to Glasgow later in the year. So that should be a really good one on climate. That's this Thursday at 5 o'clock. And then next week, we're going to be talking about ending loneliness with Andrew Giles and Holly Walker from the Helen Clark Foundation in New Zealand. They've got some new research coming out that I think will be really interesting in light of how much we had a bit of an epidemic of loneliness during the pandemic as well. So I hope you can join us for those. You can find that on the Australia Institute's website at australiainstitute.org.au. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We hope to see you in a fortnight. We'll be back, but at 1 o'clock, not 10 a.m. We just had to go a bit early today because Katharine has to head off to the budget lockup later. So yeah, it's Economist Christmas, as we call it here in the Australia Institute, but unfortunately we've been locked out of the budget lockup this year. So enjoy that, Katharine. That I
don't know if it enjoys the word, but I know the spirit that you contribute that aspiration for me. Yes, I'll think. Yeah. Anyway,
excellent,
guys.
Thanks very much, everyone. See you soon.